Welcome back, reader friends. We are updating the HRCYED board for all the things I have read this week. Thank you for being patient with me last week as we went over the board rather than reviewing some of the books I've read. We read 3 books this week, so we're going to update our board. We're going to go over our weekly favorite book. We're going to compare it to the other week's favorites, and then we're going to spin the weekly TBR to find out what I need to read before I post the next video. So get excited. We have a whole lot of books to go through and quite the variety of genres too. The first book I read is Lovely War by Julie Berry, and if you don't know, Julie Berry was on Survivor a little while ago, and I love Survivor, so blending Survivor and books for me is like my happiest of places. But I'd never read a book by her before, so I picked up Lovely War, and this is a kind of cross-genre book. It's historical fiction predominantly, but there is a fantasy element to it. There's a frame narrative. In the frame narrative, you have the goddess Aphrodite, and she is caught by her husband Hephaestus in an affair with his brother Ares. So talk about messy. And she is basically put on trial to prove that love still has value, that love is still a beautiful thing and exists. She tells the story of 2 couples. So that's kind of the frame we have, is this like court trial with this goddess. She starts in defending her case by showing the story of James, who is about to go off to war, and then Hazel, who's this pianist, and they have this moment where they kind of fall in love, and it's tracking their love story. And then the other couple is Colette and Aubrey, and Colette has this very tragic background, and Aubrey is a musician who's from Harlem. He's from the US, and he's Black. And so it's really an interesting book to discuss love with race in the midst of it, and then love in wartime, grief, and then each chapter has a heading with one of the goddesses or gods' names on it. So when the heading is Aphrodite, you know it's going to be about love. When it's about Hades, you know it's going to be about death. When it's about Apollo, you know it's going to be about music. And when it's about Ares, it's going to be about war. So every chapter, you kind of know a little bit about what you're getting yourself into, but you don't know who's going to die. You don't know what direction it's going to go in. The story itself is quite beautiful. The only critique I had was that it felt like we really centered on Hazel and James's story, and I wanted to get more out of Colette and Aubrey's story. I really liked all the characters. There wasn't anyone in this book that I was disinterested in or disliked, but I just wanted more. I think this book touches on a few big questions. One being, how do love and art survive in the face of war? And what does that look like? And how do you maintain that? And should you? Another question asks is, what role does race and grief and identity have in a time of war when history has typically overlooked those things? And what does that look like in a healthy way? And how do we have that conversation when historically it hasn't been important or prioritized? And then lastly, it asks the question, what does it mean to love when you feel too broken or unworthy of love? And how do you accept that? And do you accept that? And should you? So I think if you're interested in any of those questions, I think this book does a really beautiful job of wrestling with those and engaging in that. And so I recommend this book. I rated Lovely War 4.25 stars, mostly because there were times where it was really slow and it took me a while to really get invested. There were certain storylines I was more interested in than others, and so I was kind of waiting to get back to that, and it felt like it was taking a while. So I enjoyed all of the content of the book. I enjoyed the characters, but I was left at multiple points kind of ready for the next thing and ready to move on. I put this in 2 different categories. As per always, we know the routine. The first spot was the genre challenge, and this was put in the historical fiction category. I could technically have also put this within fantasy, but it really reads historical fiction way more than fantasy, so we kept it there. The second spot I put this in was the booktuber recommendations, and Faith's Reading Things recommended this book. I would also recommend this book, and I would be interested in reading more by Julie Berry to see what else she comes out with. The next book I read is A Witch's Guide to Magical Innkeeping, and this is the coziest, warmest fantasy book maybe ever. Like, this is the epitome of a cozy read. And so if you are looking for something that you want to sit up on a couch and not really think about the real world and not really have a strenuous reading experience, this is the book for you. This book is about a witch named Sarah Swan who was very powerful once upon a time, and then after she resurrects her great aunt from the dead, I know the plot's crazy. After she resurrects her great aunt from the dead, she loses most of her magic. And so she's now living in the world as a much diminished version of who she once was. And she has a collection of quirky characters who live at this inn with her. It's basically her quest of trying to regain her magic and figure out how she can get back to who she once was. I think the question that this book really wrestles with is, how do we define our worth when we lose what we understand to make us special? And I think it just grapples with that in a really interesting way, but also a really light-hearted way. It doesn't feel deeply tragic, but it feels genuine. There's a grief that comes with that. And so I think that's a question and a common theme through this book. The other question I think it addresses is, can things that are broken still be valuable? Can things that aren't perfect and aren't exactly as you would wish still be beautiful and worth investing in and loving and being part of? And I think if you're interested in either of those like philosophical questions, this is a really good book to read, while also being a book that if you don't want to get all philosophical and deep, that's okay too. You can just read this and breeze through it. It's a very easy read, it's very light, and it's very fun. I read another book by this author just a few months ago, which was The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. It's quite the title. She loves long titles, I've noticed that. And I loved that book. That was my first book by her, and I thought it was the most cozy fantasy ever. When I read this book, I was really excited to read from this author again, to hear what she had to say, but it felt like a copy paste. We had equally quirky side characters. We had the older romantic couple who are, supporting her, but also have their small romance side story plot going on. We had the grumpy, kind of reluctant to help out love interest. We had the kid or kids who are very lovable and play a big role in how the lead opens her heart and receives love. Which none of those things are wrong or bad. I actually enjoy all of those things as an individual thing, but it felt like we took the plot of the last book and we just redid it with a few different tweaks, but the setting felt the same, the pacing felt the same kind of big plot points happened at the same time in the book. And so if you're willing to kind of reread a very similar experience, that's great. I rated this book 4.25 stars. I really liked it. I would probably read it again. But having just finished another book by the author, it felt very copy and pasted for me, and it didn't feel super original, which I was sad about because I was excited to experience her writing and her world building, but in a slightly different way, and it kind of felt like we were in the same world just down the street. It's a really charming book. It just felt really familiar. As per always, we put this in 2 spots on the board, the first being the animals category, and we put this in for exotic pets. I was this close to putting this book in for the farm animals category because there is a resurrected chicken that is just made of bones who's quite the character, and I was like, I love this bony chicken. But I decided instead to pick exotic animals because there is a fox that talks and it's a critical part of this book, and it's a bigger character than the chicken is, and so it felt really important to acknowledge the role that the fox takes in this book. And then we also ticked off the monthly new release. So this book was released July 15th. So I read my July book in July. I have been stressed about this category since we started, so I haven't failed the challenge yet. I actually will literally fail the challenge when I don't read a new release each month. And so that's causing me some anxiety, but it has not happened yet. I'm proving to myself that I can read a book the month it comes out. It'll be okay. The third book I read was in fact Emma by Jane Austen, and if you've watched my previous videos, you know that I spun this as a classic in my TBR wheel in my last video or a video ago. So I had to read this book. I have done it, I have read it, I have enjoyed it. Emma is phenomenal. I'm gonna put this back on my shelf. Emma as a character is one of the most flawed yet lovable characters in Jane Austen's world. She has this amazing character arc that is so interesting to follow. Basically, she's this young, privileged, wealthy character, and I think one of the lines in the very first page of the books is that she's rarely had anything to vex her. Like, she's just never been troubled, and she lives this beautiful, privileged life. And so she dreams up herself as a matchmaker, and she assumes that she can make all these couples work together, and she's very involved in trying to make things work. She lacks some self-awareness, and so it's basically this journey that she goes on trying to set up this new girl that she's met. She's kind of made a project of her to develop her and find her husband, her friend Harriet. And she lives with her father, and this neighbor nearby is Mr. Knightley, and he comes and visits. And it's basically their journey in this small town as she learns and grows into a more full and rich and beautiful version of herself. And she's challenged a lot, and it's a really interesting book. I know it's a whole commentary on society because this was written in 1815, I believe, by Jane Austen. And so the people reading this when it first was released are very different, have a very different worldview than anyone like myself who's still reading it. And yet it's still a completely interesting read, and I still entirely enjoyed myself through the entire process. I think the questions that this book seeks to answer is, how does privilege impact our perception of ourselves and of others? I think it asks, how do we grow up, not just in age, but also in empathy and in character? And I also think it asks, how often do we project ourselves onto other people and assume that our perception and our projection onto them is accurate, and how do we live in a world where reality is key rather than our perception of reality? So if any of those questions interest you, Emma is the book to read. I rated this book 4.5 stars. And I rated it 4.5 because there are some characters who, while very endearing, are very long-winded. And this was a long book. And I think that I understood that this character was just the most rambly character ever, and I don't know that I needed that to be exampled every single time the character showed up. And so there were times where I was just like, oh my gosh, we have 4 pages of just this one character monologuing. And so I couldn't give it a full 5 stars. Pride and Prejudice is my favorite Austen book, and it's not better than that book. I still loved it. I will most likely go back to it again. But it sat at a 4.5 for me. As we already know from the weekly TBR spin, I put this in the classics and adaptation category. This is the classic. I have an adaptation coming that I'm excited to read about Emma. Although honestly, I could have done so many books in this spot because there are so many classics I really like or I'm really excited to read, and there are so many adaptations. So it was a hard pick, but I did decide to put this in the classic category. And then, keeping on trend, I went to the genre category and put this in for classics as well, just so that I could get the 2 classic spots completed in one book. I will most likely be reading more classics in this challenge, but I wanted to get the 2 spots fulfilled in case for whatever reason I didn't read another. As we know, each video I go over my favorite book that I read that week, and this pick would be Emma by Jane Austen. I enjoyed all of these books. They're all above 4 stars, so it was kind of hard to pick, but Emma was definitely the winner. And then to add it to my weekly favorites reading chart, this would be above One Golden Summer, but it would be below My Friends by Friedrich Bachmann. So we have 3 to our list now. I know this is going to get harder and harder to put books in the more I read, so I'm very grateful there's only 3 for now. I know when we're at 40, I'm gonna be like, no, I don't know what to pick. So I'm grateful this was just 3 books and it was a very easy middle spot. And then last but not least, we're going to spin the weekly TBR to see what I need to read before we post the next video. So here we go. There are a few things I'd be nervous to get for this. So I'm hoping it's something good. Let's see. Oh, okay, genre challenge. I can do that. I have, I think, 3 categories left for this, so this shouldn't be too hard. I know romance is one of them, and typically those are pretty quick and easy reads. We'll see what I come up with, but genre challenge, I can hang with that. I can do that. That is all for this video. I'm going to put my stats on the screen so you can see how many books I've read, how far into the challenge we are, and what's coming up next. In the meantime, keep reading, keep resting, and I will see you soon.